Scott Drew will be the next head basketball coach at Kentucky. At least that's the sentiment right now. And I think it's going to happen. This is Locked On Big 12.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy wild coaching news, everybody. I'm Drake Toll from Locked On Big 12, America's #1 Big 12 podcast. That is Cameron Stewart from Locked On Baylor. Let's talk why Scott Drew will be the next coach at Kentucky. We'll also discuss why Scott Drew could maybe stay in Waco, as well as the very end. If you lose Kim Mulkey, Scott Drew and the football team sucks. Is Baylor athletics done forever? Very nice. Scott Drew is going to get an offer from Kentucky. That's the expectation. Yep. That is astronomical. It's Kentucky. They can afford to, in essence, double his salary at Baylor. It sits somewhere around $5 million. It is the mecca of college basketball. Lexington has one of the greatest palaces in the nation as well. Recruiting, I just could laud the Big Blue forever. Why? Why do you think this might be the big one for Scott Drew?
Well, quite simply, Drake, it's Kentucky.
Yeah.
Kind of all the reasons you just talked about. You know, you and I, we've been through this. We've heard the Scott Drew rumors for like every job. You know, if somebody asks you to put it in college football terms, it's the Matt Campbell meme. And now, like, that's what it's been in basketball with Scott Drew. Some of them more serious than others, but like none of them, weirdly, were better than what he was doing at Baylor. You'd have to go back 15 years when Memphis hired Josh Pastner to replace Calipari. That was like the closest Scott Drew came, at least in the public eye, to leaving. And since then, with all the programs that have come up, a lot of them being, you know, big name programs that are down on their luck, Indiana and Louisville come to mind. Like those jobs right now aren't as good as what Scott Drew has built at Baylor. And to the point where Scott Drew is such a legend in Waco, he has built it from the ashes to the point where really there's like that Mount Rushmore of college basketball jobs be the only ones you would worry about. And I'm talking Kansas, North Carolina, Duke, and Kentucky. And here we are. And so like at this point in his life, I think there's a school of thought that Scott Drew could be thinking, you know, I've done what I can at Baylor. I have put them in a much, much better place than I found it, maybe better than any college basketball program ever has in terms of where we started versus where we ended up. And he's thinking, you know, I don't know maybe how sustainable it can be. To the expectations have changed. I don't know if we can go to the Final Four every year like Baylor fans seem to want. But at Kentucky, we can do that. And like I've accomplished my goals at Baylor, now I can have the #1 college coaching job in America. I think there is a school of thought there that even our great Scott Drew, who we hold in such high esteem and hold differently than so many other coaches, that he could be thinking that too.
This is insane, by the way. 20 years ago, you say that Scott Drew, Kentucky is trying to hire Scott Drew. This job is, it's the job. I understand that aspect of it, but the one thing that people are using to really get to why Scott is the choice is this Mitch Barnhart relationship. How much do you read into that being the catalyst?
This is interesting because I've found this also kind of weird. So undeniably, he has a very good relationship with Mitch Barnhart. Like we know, and the story behind it is 2021 when they're in the bubble. Mitch Barnhart's basically the glorified chaperone from the NCAA for the hotel. Obviously, Baylor stays there longer than anybody. They win the national championship. And so they apparently developed a great relationship there. Now, you and I both know Scott Drew limitedly. He is friends with about anybody. Like That's he's true. Such a nice guy that shocks nobody. And so does he have a better relationship with Mitch Barnhart than a lot of other ADs? I'm guessing yes. But then again, he is friends with everyone. He even tried to be friends with Rick Barnes, who just hated him. But like everyone else, maybe outside of the late Bobby Knight with that story, is friends with Scott Drew. And so I think there is something there, Drake, but I think it's made out to be a little bit more than what it actually is. Like, I don't think he goes to Lexington in the offseason, has fettuccine Alfredo with Mitch Barnhart.
Question in the front. Along with that, this is the one I just find so odd. Jeff Goodman, who is
talk about friends with everyone. Yeah.
Plays pickleball with Scott. 12 hours later, Jeff hops on his own show and says, Scott Drew to Kentucky. Like, that's he rode that candidate first. He said, that's the one that I think, that they're going to go after him, and this could be it. Is there a coincidence then that we talk about the relationship with Mitch Barnhart? Is there a coincidence that guys play pickleball together, a little bit of this, a little bit of that? They're talking like, oh, Cal might leave. And then 12 hours later, Goodman says, oh, this could be the guy.
I think you have to put something there. You got to put some stock in there. Scott also loves the national guys, the national writers, the broadcasters. He is very close with those guys. Jeff Goodman, very much among them. And so I'm guessing Jeff had probably some news that Cal might have been leaving or think about leaving Kentucky and broached the subject with Scott. And Scott Drew probably said something like, oh, that's Kentucky. You can't rule that out, or something like that. And then that becomes a thing. But this is also, it's not on a podcast that he's doing this. It's on the pickleball court. So if he had been like, no way, I would never consider Kentucky, he probably would have told Jeff that. So him saying that he wouldn't say no, which I'm guessing is what happened, doesn't mean automatically he's going to take the job. But it is closer to that than it is to a denial, right? Like, so there is, that's the thing with this is it's been so many rumor mills the last couple of days that where there's smoke, there's a little bit of fire, I think, in just about all of these.
Yeah, especially the fact that Goodman was never on Scott to Louisville and typically keeps Scott out of the front running for a lot of these major jobs. Even looking back at Indiana and the hirings they've made since Scott's had success at Baylor. For Kentucky fans, they don't seem very happy about this across the board. Why is that, you think?
This is a great question. I don't know. I get it to some extent. People bring up the 3 straight round of 32 exits. Like, okay, yeah, I can hear that out. We're frustrated with that here. Not enough to fire the coach, but frustrated, sure. But then I'm seeing people in comments and on social media now that are like, he missed the NCAA tournament like 8 times. I'm like, well, 5 or 6 of those, he literally has like single digit scholarship numbers. And like, he came into a situation where one of the team's players murdered another one. And
which
then
isn't good.
And then the coach tried to like make him out to be a drug dealer. So like, I think a lot of Kentucky fans don't really remember the context of what he comes into at Baylor. So when you look at the totality of the numbers, you're like, oh, well, that's not that impressive. Whereas, you take into context, it's one of the most impressive coaching jobs, in the last 50 years or so, maybe ever, considering all the context in there. So I think they do look at I think some Kentucky fans are looking at the recent failures in the NCAA tournament and saying, well, that's no different from what Calipari was giving us the last couple of years. Yeah. And they've had better regular seasons than Calipari's had the last couple of years. So there's the double-edged sword of that. But I think that's part of it, taking the whole resume into there. And the other thing is they think he's like a Sunday school teacher, which he kind of is, but they think like he's just this Bible thumper, like not going to teach any basketball in Big Blue Nation. And I'm like, that's not the case. There's this weird misconception about Scott Drew. And I'm still seeing some others who are like, no, he's too defensive to win in this league. We don't want games ending 59-55. And I'm like, well, what are we? Because I'm sitting here doing shows about how the defense isn't good enough for Baylor, and they're top 10 in Ken Palm adjusted offense the last 4 years. So I just think there's a lack of information in the Big Blue Nation around who Scott Drew is. And still others just think he's too much of a cornball. He's not going to be able to handle the pressure and the vipers that come with the Kentucky job. And those people want Rick Pitino. So there are a couple of things that I'm seeing, at least on social media and on my videos and things like that. And that seems to be the case. They think he's too corny and that he misses the tournament too much when he has single digit scholarship numbers.
Let's talk about why Scott Drew might stay at Baylor. could stay at Baylor, will stay at Baylor. This is Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. I wish there were odds on who the next coach of Kentucky would be. Scott Drew would probably be the odds-on favorite. This calendar of sports is loaded, and FanDuel is making it even more exciting to get in on the action because right now new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. You can be like me and go bet on the Rangers to beat the Oakland Athletics. That's likely going to happen, though it didn't happen the other night. That's $200 if you use bet. If you can use to bet the tourney, MLB, NBA, NHL, and so much more. You know, the tourney, golf. Visit FanDuel.com/locked on to make your first bet a big win. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. FanDuel.com/locked on. Kentucky fans, good news. Scott Drew is staying in Waco. If that's what the headline reads, if that makes the day of Big Blue Nation, what was it? Was it the daughter who goes to Baylor? The nice new house that Kentucky could probably double in size, by the way. Why is Scott going to stay in Waco?
Well, if that's the headline, it's probably because he looked at the message boards or he looked in the comments or he looked on Twitter. Like, right. I don't want to make too much out of that, but it is something that Kentucky fans really do not seem to be embracing, the fact that Scott Drew could well be their head coach today. But I think if he does decide to stay at Baylor, which unbelievably so, I'm still leaning towards, but slightly at this point, it is just kind of the, I don't know if sentimentality is the right word of it, but like the fact that he is already a legend here. He is always going to be a legend here. He will never have to buy a Dr. Pepper in Waco. Versus if you go to Kentucky and it doesn't work out, that's a really, really sour note for something that a career that you've had 2 decades building and gone in the right direction. And I think if he does go to Kentucky, he'll have success. But there is that's a major difference going from the Baylor basketball coach to the Kentucky basketball coach, just in terms of everything that's around it. You and I both know that, like dealing, in the Baylor media circles, it is not that way in Lexington. And if you are even just making the tournament and going out in the round of 32 or 64, like he has done a couple of times here in the last few years with Baylor, then that is just, you got for sale signs on your lawn. You've got potentially death threats in your mailbox. Like it is a completely different deal. And I know there are some reports out there, and to be honest, I have no idea how much this actually plays into it because I don't know Coach Drew's wife, but saying that she wants a private life and she can have that in Waco and not in Lexington. So I don't know how much truth there is to that, but if she is leaning that way, then that part of it is absolutely true. They could live in perfect harmony here in Waco, whether they're winning national championships or not, and they can't have that in Lexington. And it's a much different deal, much different market, and a much different lifestyle for everything outside of what goes on the court.
The Scott Drew joy thing, Jesus, others, yourself. Mm-hmm. Can you get away with that at Kentucky? Is that, if he's sitting down in these interviews saying, look, I can't veer from my culture, I just don't know if that sticks. And it seems like that's one thing that Kentucky fans, again, are pointing to. Oh, this guy is a guy who goes to church,
The youth pastor, yeah.
Right. There's too much. Does joy disqualify him from a job like Kentucky?
No, but conditionally. If he goes to the Sweet 16 or the Elite Eight in the first year, they will be printing Joy t-shirts by the millions there in Kentucky. They will be leading their own, they will give Scott Drew his own local access Sunday school TV show if they win. But if you have a round of 32 exit and he's up there saying, there are some things that are more important, we buy that more than Kentucky would. They won't want to hear that. They might become Satanists there. They might turn their back. I think Kentucky is still, it's a good Christian state, of course. So I'm not saying they're going to burn crosses or anything, but they're going to if you're not winning, it's not going to sell with them. Whereas with Baylor, it was a process the whole time, and he is very much in tune with what the university is going after, what the alumni base is looking for, what the administration is looking for, and has been able to build alongside it. So can it succeed? Yes, but only if the basketball succeeds. Whereas at Baylor, if they don't make a Final Four again and he coaches here another 8 or 10 years, there'll be a lot of what could have been, but he'll still be remembered as one of the biggest legends in the history of the school.
That the idea that if he stays, he could be a legend, get a statue. I don't know if that's a huge concern to him, having worked around him. But another one of the aspects of this, for a guy who's a legend at a university, helped build the basketball program into what it is, why even listen to the interview? And I know we're talking in this segment about why he's going to stay to Baylor. Why do the interview? Why listen to Kentucky if you know this is where you want to be the rest of your life? Is there some sort of negotiating power he gets from this? I mean, and reminder, all of his assistant coaches are leaving. Not a bad thing. Not a bad thing. We're getting head coaching jobs for the most part. But certainly puts him in an even tougher spot going into next year.
Yeah. And so I think he goes through with this just because he hasn't been able to hear an offer quite like what Kentucky is going to offer. And I think it is worth kicking the tires on that. And, there's a chance Barnhart gives him the Godfather offer that he cannot refuse. And I think you hear that out. One thing that I also think is worth kind of talking about is I think Kentucky's the best job in college basketball. I think you're about in the same place. At worst, they're the second best job in all of college basketball. But it is interesting, and I know there's context behind these things, that Nate Oates said no. Dan Hurley has all but said no. I know that offer is probably still out there to him, but he's said no to interviewers. And Calipari left. Like, I get it. 15 years, had a heck of a run. He talks about they need to hear a different voice. But like, there was no scandal. There was no huge attrition that we've heard about between the administration or Barnhart and Calipari. He wants to go. And normally we would think Kentucky is a job that no one would want to leave. And in the past, it certainly looked like that. People have had to been forced out or go to the NBA to get out of the Kentucky job. So I think there is something to that and wondering if other coaches are just like, is this worth it? Nate Oates, I got a good thing going at Alabama. I know it's not Kentucky, but it's not that far off in terms of resources and how people care and things like that. And I think that's obviously a bigger drop off in terms of resources from a school like Alabama or UConn to Baylor. But Baylor does put a lot of resources into it comparatively to the rest of the athletic department. He is one of the best paid coaches in all of college basketball, even at a school like Baylor. And so I think there might be something to where he's like, this offer is just not good enough. I'm doing really well at Baylor. I've got all the things I want at Baylor. My family has all the things I want at Baylor, and I'm not making that much less. So I do wonder why a couple of coaches said no right away to what I think is the best job in college basketball. I think that is worth noting.
This could be bad. If Scott leaves Baylor, this could be bad. Let's talk about it. This is Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV. Two things that you shouldn't mix, the Amazon and Fire. Unless you place a TV there. Amazon Fire TV has all kinds of sports options channels. That's your destination for live games, highlights, in-depth analysis, and they have amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs. That's right. Whether it's opening weekend for baseball or the college basketball tournament, which is over, you're going to want to have a Fire TV. Fire TV recently created Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands for free. All of us at Locked On are on there, including big pro leagues as well. Not to mention great news, entertainment, gaming, travel, cooking videos as well. Check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. Trust me. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFire TV. That is Amazon.com/LockedOnFire TV. In a world where Kim Mulkey's gone, say Scott Drew leaves Baylor. Dave Aranda just went 3-9, brought in the 60th best recruiting class, 9th best transfer class in the Big 12. Feels like everything, Baylor was irrelevant in athletics 20 years ago. And then around the he who should not be named era, became one of the coolest, brightest schools in the country.
Yeah.
If Scott Drew departs, do you, especially as bad as baseball is, do you enter an era of, we're not great at anything except for acrobatics and tumbling?
Yes. And I said it on Locked On Baylor yesterday. Until millions of people come out to watch acrobatics and tumbling on TV, then yes, that's what you'll be. I don't think it's unfair to say that if Scott Drew leaves, you're a dumpster fire in the short term. Now you will have good options for your next head basketball coach because of that Scott Drew coaching tree. I think, Jerome Tang gets the call. Grant McCaslin, that might be a little tougher to get him away from Tech, although the Tech fans are really sweating it out. And even a John Jacobs is still on the table, a guy who just took the head coaching job at FAU. So you've got some options there, but you just don't know. You're in the wilderness if Scott Drew leaves. I mean, Scott Drew right now at this moment is the face of Baylor athletics. That Baylor men's basketball program has been keeping us alive the last couple of years. Yeah. I think women's basketball is in a fine spot, but it's not the powerhouse it was. I think Nikki Collins building something good with the women's basketball team. But to your original point, then yes, we're right back to 2004. 2003, where the only thing you've got is a women's basketball program on the rise. You don't have the murder scandal, hopefully, but yes, you're right back to that, a men's tennis and women's basketball school. But I mean, you just look at the bare bones of it. Football down, baseball down, women's basketball okay. Men's basketball becomes a humongous question mark.
I want to cover your bases there, but you say women's basketball, okay, in the context of where it has been. Good, great in the context of the rest of the country, but not at an elite level where it was at least. So then, I mean, who do you point the finger at? I mean, when I was in Waco, heard plenty of things about current administration and things that just are like, there are coaches that feel as though they're being left behind. There are players and personnel that feel as though the current atmosphere in the athletic department is not constructive. Is there one person to pin this on? Because, buddy, things have not been going well for the last 2 years ish, and are really not going well today.
I don't know that there's any one person that you can pin it on. But if Scott Drew leaves, you look at athletic director Mack Rhoades and say, how does this happen? I know there was some parts of the fan base that were okay to see Kim Mulkey leave. Another portion was adamantly not okay to see Kim Mulkey leave. Yeah. And the whole fan base would say, what are we doing? How can we not keep Scott Drew? Even though it's Kentucky making the call. I know that's a tough draw, and I like Mack, and I really like what he's done for the athletic department. But if Scott Drew leaves, you look at two Hall of Famers out the door and staking his job to a 3-9 coach. That's just the bare bones of it. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And so I don't know that you can blame it totally on one person with all the context, but of course it would fall on Mack Rhoades' lap. And one other thing that I hate using this excuse all the time nowadays, but I think it does fit with what would happen if Scott Drew were to leave. It is that Baylor does still need to remember its place in all this, and that there are schools out there with a lot more money and a lot more resources to do this. Yeah. I don't want to play totally poor, but what we've experienced the last decade at Baylor is the golden era of Baylor athletics. Right. And when small schools have that, their coaches get poached. And this would have happened in a 3 very different ways in a long period of time. One football coach gets fired due to scandal, but then you look at that, Matt Rule has success right after. He gets an NFL job and now gets a major college coaching job at Nebraska. Kim Mulkey builds this thing into a dynasty. She gets a quote unquote bigger job, although LSU is not the same program, gets a lot of money to go and coach there, more than almost any women's college coach. And then you would fall into Scott Drew, where it's like, oh, but he left for Kentucky. You can't blame Baylor for that. But it's the end of a long cycle here where you finally get a golden era and where you thought you were holding on to these people for life, you didn't. I mean, because if I had told you 10 years ago, 2014, okay, look at what you've got. Art Briles in football, Kim Mulkey women's basketball, Scott Drew, even before the national championship in basketball, you would say none of those guys are ever leaving. Right. These people are retiring at Baylor. And now we are unfortunately very close to seeing the third of those three leave, with another up and coming coach in a major sport like Matt Rule gone in between. So yeah, it would be a disaster. I don't know that you can blame any one person, but it would bring us to a point where we'd have to reevaluate how the administration is handling athletics and athletics money and how Baylor wants to use it going forward. Because the other thing too, Drake, and I know you know a lot about this, is Baylor has used athletics majorly the last 10, 15 years as a way to grow the school, to grow the brand of Baylor. We've seen a couple of rebrands in that time since RG3 won the Heisman. I'll go back to that. And it was a huge engine for me as a kid from Massachusetts to learn about Baylor. I'm sure it was for you, one state over in Arkansas. Like, that is Baylor's way of getting their message out to the world. 100%. And if you're going to go back into this wilderness that you were in the early aughts in terms of athletics, you're at the bottom of the pile, and you're not having this 50-50 split of Texas students versus out-of-state students. You're not having the national platform that you had. I
don't want to be Wake Forest. If I'm Baylor, I don't want to be Wake Forest. I don't want to go into that, and look, it probably feels like a pessimistic view, and it'd be easy as if you're a Baylor fan to look at, be like, oh, this is just pessimism. No. I want you to go back to 2015, 2014, what it was like to be a Baylor fan. Now, look, Ian McCaw, Art Briles, the way that Baylor got there, I'm not lauding that, but I want you to go back to what it felt like to wake up on August 27th, on that Wednesday, and think, everything's good. Everything's good at this school. To see it now a decade later just be far from that and could get even further from that is something I think we should all look at and say, where did it go wrong entirely? Because it came back there with Mac Rhodes very early on, and now it feels like it might be gone again. Pessimism, maybe you can say that. I just miss that era of Baylor athletics, not the way it got there, but where Baylor was at its peak in the golden era. So you want to close out on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can put myself in that position pretty easily, Drake, because that's when I was looking at going to Baylor. That's when I was a senior in high school and starting at Baylor. When I started there in the fall of 2015, I don't think it's unfair to say it was maybe the hottest school in the country. Yep. Like, in terms of, obviously the football success and the new stadium and the building more on the campus and
Selena Gomez goes out in public with a Baylor shirt on, and I think she named her dog Baylor, Yes, there's a lot to it. It was very, very cool and very hot, and it was a sleeping giant that was just starting to wake up. And maybe we did see the wake up of it in 2021 with the national championship in men's basketball and the Sugar Bowl in football, but it would feel like a really stark decline from the time that I started at Baylor to now, if Scott Drew does leave and you're searching for answers in the athletic department. That's Cameron Stewart, Drake Toll from Locked On Big 12, America's #1 Big 12 podcast. Thanks for joining us. Tough times in Waco. This has been and always will be Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. No se grande.